Okay.
Вы это записываете всегда, да?
Да, мы ведем прямую трансляцию. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Globus Books. For those who are visiting us for the first time, Globus Books has been your neighborhood bookseller since 1971. And over the years, we've grown from small publisher and bookstores specializing in Russian language books into a vibrant cultural space for our wonderfully multilingual communities, including speakers of Belarusian, Ukrainian, Russian, Georgian, and English, of course. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing a very special guest, historian, author, and cultural preservation is Dr. Nina Bogdan.
Thank you.
Being born and raised right here in San Francisco, Dr. Bogdan dedicated her career to exploring the complex history of Russian immigration and identity in America. If you've ever come across a book about Russian diaspora here in San Francisco, chances are Nina's work has guided you through that history. Some of her earlier works include Russian San Francisco, part of the series Images of America, and The Dissolution of Exile, a Russian Family Odyssey, which is based on her extensive research across Russia, Ukraine, and China. Lately, Dr. Bogdan completed 160 pages of Russian American history context for San Francisco Planning Department, documenting how Russian Americans helped to shape the cultural scene of the city. And we will touch on the document later tonight, but mostly our talk will be built around her newly released book, Before We Disappear into Oblivion, San Francisco's Russian Diaspora from Revolution to Cold War. And today's format will be relaxed conversation. I will begin with a few questions to Dr. Bogdan. We might hear some reading, and then we'll open the floor to your questions and comments, and maybe even personal family stories connected to this history. We will wrap up the night with a book signing and informal tea drinking, so please stay, mingle, and enjoy the rest of the night with us. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Bogdan, for can I speak for Nina? Yes. Okay, thank you. For finding time to meet our friends and neighbors. And thank you so much for this impressive historical document, which is also filled with fascinating personal stories. And before we move on with the book, what was your family personal immigration story? And what made you choose to dedicate your career to exploring this very subject?
Well, thank you for having me, and I very much appreciate all the work that you put into arranging this meeting, and thank you to everybody for coming. Actually, that's not true. My mother, so she was from a first wave family, but she didn't arrive in the United States until after World War II. Her family lived in Simbirsk, now Ulyanovsk, and they, of course, had to. This was her father and her grandparents. They had to leave during the Civil War. They lived temporarily in Siberia, in Krasnoyarsk, and across the border into Harbin, as did so many others, in about 1920. So my mother was born in Harbin. Then she lived there with her family, her sister, her mother, and her great aunt, and all four of them left Harbin in 1953, went to Brazil, and eventually she came to the United States around 1959, and that's where she met my father in San Francisco. My father was a DP, displaced person, after World War II. He was born in Ukraine. He was an Ostarbeiter. The Germans took him to work in Germany. Then he lived in a camp after the war, and he eventually was able to come to the United States, and that's where they met. And that's why I was born in San Francisco. And another question?
What, I
Well,
mean,
the
being
book,
born in San
right.
Francisco, yeah, immigrant family, but anyways, not everybody will choose the path of dedicating the career to exploring the immigration in the city.
Right. Well, so I had another career before that. I worked for the FBI for 23 years. And so I didn't have anything to do with academia. And then at a certain point, I decided I need to do something else. And I worked as a translator for myself. And about that time, a friend of mine, he does a Viduha, she suggested to do this book. Because she looked and she couldn't find anything. They had, Chinese San Francisco and Irish San Francisco, but there was no Russian San Francisco. So she said, we should do Russian San Francisco. I had never thought about that before. It just came out of nowhere. I was working on my family history book. And so we did that, and I really liked how it turned out. I felt like we did a pretty good job. And I thought that was it. I mean, that's it. What else is there to say? It's all in there. And then I decided that I wanted to further my education, and I moved away because I couldn't afford to do it here. And I went to University of Arizona and earned a PhD. And again, I had no intention of writing this book because, number one, I didn't think there would be any interest in it. There's always been this attitude about emigres in the scholarly community that they're just a bunch of uninterested people who sat around and mourned the loss of empire. So I didn't think that anyone would encourage me to do it. I had I was going to do a comparative study of some kind of educational institutions between the Soviet Union and the United States. It had to do with indigenous people, and that was this idea I had, and that went all out the window. When I did a research paper that had to do with the parade from 1925, I was just looking for something to do for that particular seminar. And one of my professors said, well, this is really interesting. So was there a community? And I said, yeah, of course there was. And it just snowballed from there that I had interest from my scholarly colleagues. And once I started, I became obsessed, because once the ideas began coming and I started doing the initial research, I just, that was it. So I decided that's what I wrote my dissertation, which is very long. It's like this long. So, but if you want to know all the details, then you can read my dissertation. And then I knew that I would want to turn it into a book because I felt it would be an interesting book. I know it's sort of limited interest, but I still wanted to do it because once I started doing the research, it was really fascinating. I found really great sources. One of the best was a complete run of Ruskaya Жизнь from 1922 to 1927. That's at the Library of Congress. It's like reading a novel. I mean, you just get such an idea of what the community was like, and other sources that came my way as the more research that I did, the more I found out, and so that's how I ended up writing the book. It was almost by chance,
Yeah, but this is an amazing piece of history, and my first question would be, in Russian, we all often use term wave for the mass exodus. And how accurate is the term? And what was the Russian presence here in California in the city before their so-called first wave? Yeah.
Well, I think people use that term because it's easier to keep it straight. It may have started, with how Russians talk about it, but I think it's very common. The problem is that the first wave wasn't really the first wave. So now we refer to the wave before the first wave as the zero wave. And that's really not, that's kind of insulting. So there's no way to change that now. But also, interestingly and unfortunately, we now have a fifth wave because there's even a publication that's coming out in Holland. I think it's being published and it's called The Fifth Wave. So they seem to be continuing. I would say it's not a bad way to describe the immigration process because they are kind of distinct. But as everyone knows, the first and second wave are very, very closely connected. And then in the Soviet period in the 1970s, fourth wave is considered, I think, around the 1990s. So it does just, you can sort of describe the immigration process that way. But, I think at this point, people are used to it, and that's why they use it. With respect to San Francisco, there is, when discussing the Russian presence, there is a sort of a tendency to talk about the Orthodox community as being Russian in 19th century San Francisco. But the fact is there were hardly any Russians here. Most of the people who were Orthodox were Serbs, but the church was run time. So all of the clergy that arrived beginning about in the 1860s or so were Russian. So the clergy was all Russian, but the congregation was actually Serbian, Greek, Syrian, Romanian, and Native Alaskan, because so many converted in Alaska. And I think in part people also get confused because a lot of Native Alaskans, when they converted, they took Russian names. So they were sort of identified as Russians because of the name, if anybody cared to know. But in general, there were very few Russians in terms of community. You had Russians that came here individually, and I talk about that a little bit in the book. The family, they call it the Gordon Kerr. I think that their actual name was Gurgenev, who were socialists, but from a elite sort of family, and they apparently had to leave Russia because the Hrana was after them. And so they settled in Sonoma County, and they had connection with the immigrant community once the immigrant community started to arrive, which was interesting because they identified as socialists, but they still associated with the immigrant community and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. So you had these individuals coming, but there was no Russian community per se. The community was Orthodox, and it was very multi-ethnic. And then, of course, there were the non-Orthodox. So the prior to 1917, prior to 1914, actually, when the World War I started, you had several thousand spiritual Christians arriving, the Mullahkaimi, and people usually talk on that. And so they settled immediately on Potrero Hill here in San Francisco and started to build that community. So they were already here when the emigres arrived. But that was the Russian community. Of course, there's a Russian Jewish community in the Fillmore. And that was sort of an ongoing process because you had most of them coming to the East Coast beginning in about the 1880s. They were fleeing the empire because of Book of Roma and everything. and they settled mostly in the East Coast, but those that decided to come overland to San Francisco, or so they had a community. To the 1906 earthquake, they were largely south of Market, that all of that burned down. And so by the time the emigres came, Russian Jewish, because there were different Jewish communities too. There were the German Jewish community. So the Russian Jewish community had kind of a presence already in the Fillmore prior to the arrival of the emigres.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about neighborhoods, the major neighborhoods for the Russian settlements. But what was their, how were Russians perceived by the general American public in San Francisco?
Well, you mean we're talking about the period of once the emigres started arriving?
Yes.
Well, a lot of the impressions that people had, they would get that from public discourse, from newspapers. And I noticed as I was doing my research that there was really an inordinate amount of attention paid to women emigres, and in the newspapers, they really made an effort to have these elaborate drawings of women in Russian costume or in furs, and there was always some kind of story about, this beautiful. It was always a beautiful Russian emigre who has lost her home, and so this sort of attention paid to supposedly Russian aristocrats who seemed to be generally female, who were emigrating. Prior to the main wave of Russians arriving, the United States experienced the first Red Scare. That was from 1918 to 1920. And in that time period, they were deporting quite a few people. They were rounding up anarchists. They were rounding up communists. And so Russian men sort of had a reputation as being sort of violent, anarchistic, problematic immigrants. And so there's really no distinguishing between, classes or who was who, because in the period that the Red Scare was going on, there was quite a bit of unrest. There were even plans by the government they drew up plans for all kind of war plans for domestic insurrection and so on and so forth. And Russians were seen in general as problematic because a lot of them who arrived prior to 1917 were laborers, and they worked in very difficult jobs, like in anthracite coal mines in Pennsylvania, in steel mills, in mines in the West. And so these were difficult and dangerous jobs. They had no protections, and so they tried to improve their working conditions, and sometimes that led to violence. And so they got a reputation as being sort of rabble rousers, and the deportations and everything address that kind of thing. So there was kind of this dichotomy of, the beautiful aristocratic woman, yes, we can allow her in. The aggressive, anarchistic Russian male, not really. So once the process began and emigres started to arrive in larger numbers, it became sort of commonplace that everyone was detained if you arrived in steerage, which is third class. And most people were arriving in steerage because they didn't have any money. So some people were detained at Angel Island for a day, and that was usually the norm, a day, maybe 2 days. And then others were detained for longer times, which ended up causing a lot of problems for people. So that became standard. But among the general public, I don't think they knew really anything about Russia. The impression was also they knew nothing about the Civil War in Russia. It meant nothing to them. There were references to the fact that people were constantly being asked, like, why did you come here? They had no knowledge of what was going on. And so the stereotypical kind of view of who Russians were was sort of entrenched at that time, that they were either these useless aristocrats who
so sorry.
didn't sorry, I lost my train of thought. Who were welcome because they were interesting and not dangerous, and then the other side of the coin was, well, we have to check. In fact, it was stated several times that all Russians were under suspicion of having some connection to the Bolshevik regime, even though it was completely illogical in many cases. I give an example of how two officials of the Kolchak government came, and obviously they were anti-Bolshevik, but they were still detained. And there was no reason given for their detention. And then there was a headline in the newspaper the next day that, the Russians have been released, and, but no real indication of why they were detained in the first place, except for the fact that they were suspected of having Bolshevik ties of some kind. So there are all these sort of exaggerated kind of stereotypical ideas about who Russians were at that time.
Thank you. There's another example that was very surprising to me, and I'm talking about the students from Harbin during 1920s. That they were imagined very people thought that they were very exotic and always described them as people who came from China and probably will use drugs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
So
the other issue was that the Russians that were coming at this time from to San Francisco were coming from the Orient. I mean, that was the term that was used. And, the Orient was an exotic place and also, suspicious. So there was all kinds of communications between government officials, students coming from the Orient, and why are they coming, and going to somehow affect labor, the cost of labor, because they're going to work, there'll be cheap labor, and so on and so forth. And so, yes, the fact that they were coming from the Orient contributed to this idea that they might have some kind of strange practices. And one of the students wrote that they have this idea that we're all opium because we were coming from China. And of course, that had to do with, racism and the attitudes towards Chinese people. But I found that kind of interesting too when I read that this was something that they had to deal with.
Yeah. Since we're talking about jobs, maybe we can cover that subject as well. What was the major picture for the people who were arriving back then? What options do they have, and how did they deal personally with the change in their lifestyles and overall well-being?
So most Russians, even though the emigre wave is considered to be quite educated, and they were for the most part, they didn't speak English. If they spoke another language, it was usually French or German. Those that spoke English or could understand English or had some knowledge of it were obviously a couple of steps ahead, and so they tended to do better. But because of the language, there were plenty of jobs available in the 1920s. This is before the Depression. And so the problem was, of course, that the jobs were all fairly difficult, as I had mentioned before. The lumber mills, laying railroad track, other jobs like janitors or
Washing cable cars.
Yes, or train cars. Yes, washing train cars. So for men who had fought in the Civil War and who were a little bit older, obviously it was problematic because many of them had disabilities. They'd been injured. So it was difficult, but they managed to get by in most cases. although I would say a significant percentage probably worked menial jobs for the rest of their lives. The students were a really interesting group, and they were actually the group that I started with because I found, another source base that I found was they all filled out applications in Russian to the committee, first to the committee in Harbin that was helping them get visas to the United States, and then they filled out another application once they arrived because they started the Russian Students Association, Russian National Students Association. So they wanted to join, and so all of those applications had invaluable information about these students. So I started with that group trying to figure out, what happened to them once they arrived in the United States. So most of them, there's a group of about 550 that I was looking at initially who arrived between 1921 and 1925. And most of them did not attend university because they could not learn English fast enough to be. It's one thing to learn English if you're having just a conversation with someone, say, if you're buying something in a store. It's quite another if you're trying to enter university. So by the time that they learned the English, it was just too late for them to attend. And the other thing was money. They were all pretty much impoverished because many of these students were actually veterans of the war, and they had crossed the border because the army was falling apart. So they came to China with nothing, and they still had nothing when they came to the United States. So even though in relative terms it was much less expensive to attend university, at that time, most people who went to places like the University of California, Berkeley, were of at least the upper middle class, because not everybody could afford to go, even if they had the the education. There are also scholarships available, but not everybody could get those. So most of them and ended up either doing something else or working at. Those that did and who completed a degree were the ones who were the best off down the road. They either became engineers or professors at university, or some kind of prestigious job, or they opened their own business. But that was a fairly small percentage because not everybody could attend the university. And with women, the student group consisted of about 85% men, and the rest were women. So some women were able also to attend university through just determination and some people had parents that helped them if they were young enough, but most people just didn't have any money. And some women were able to do it and were very successful. But again, it was the same situation. If they didn't speak English well enough and if they didn't have the money, then whatever plans they had to attend university just tended to fall by the wayside.
It seems like men and women handled their new lives differently. Those skyrocketed rates of suicides for men, while women also had jobs, but they managed better. Is there any explanation to that? Well,
I don't know exactly what the explanation is, but that's true. The suicide rate among men was really high. I was very shocked at that. And you're right. The women, there were cases of suicide, but they were, much fewer that I could tell. I tend to think that with men, again, they fought in the war. So what we know now as PTSD, it was then called shell shock. Many had injuries from the war again. If they had a disability that was severe, they couldn't really work or find a good job. So those kinds of causes are fairly obvious, but it was surprising to me because of the narrative about immigration. I knew going in that in China and in Europe that the suicide rate was very high for Russian immigrant men. But when you hear the immigration story to the United States, it's supposed to be a positive story because they have managed to finally get here, and they have all this opportunity and hope for the future, but that actually is not sufficient for people who have these severe trauma and mental health issues. So so I would, when I was doing the research and looking at individual people, I would always, when I saw their year of death, I would always have this sinking feeling if they were young, because 10-1, it probably meant that they committed suicide. And I think with women, women also suffered during the Civil War. There were women who worked as nurses, and they experienced all the horrific situations as well. But for whatever reason, they, their trauma came out perhaps in different ways. There were people who were institutionalized in the United States, and that actually might be the topic of my next book. We'll talk about that later. But I found in general that Russian women, there tended to be more Russian women who were institutionalized than men. So maybe that explains kind of what happened with the women as opposed to the men.
Another thing that you write in your book is that young women, somewhere between those who arrived at the States, between 20 and 30 years old, would often choose not to have children, which is also a very sad, fascinating fact, how immigration influenced female population.
Yes. In general, the immigrant population worldwide, I think scholars who have studied other groups have seen this as well, that the childbirth rate was fairly low among immigrants. And I noticed it in San Francisco as well, that even people who married and seemed to have stable economic lives didn't have children. And it was just too often to be a natural sort of consequence. It just statistically, I just don't think it's possible. So I'm not sure what the reasons were. I tend to think that in practical terms, they were economic. If you didn't have kids, then it was just a lot easier to get by. But I think there's something more than that as well, that they didn't feel at home necessarily, and they didn't feel comfortable thinking about raising a child here. I'm not sure, because that's not something that you could glean from correspondence. People didn't really talk about, things like that in correspondence. So you just have to sort of figure out, from other sources what the reasons were. But it definitely, there were many, many people who did not have children among the immigrant community.
Yeah, I just found it interesting that, for example, Russian immigrants adopt a lot of liberties that were not available to them in Imperial Russia, for example, for religious reasons like divorce and getting remarried, for example. And speaking of children, even though, as we now know, some women prefer not to have any kids, there were public institutions that would help to watch over kids while parents are at work. And if we can cover the childcare and generally attention to education for the kids and keeping the education about Russia specifically going, and maybe some other organizations that would provide some support.
Yes. So despite the fact that they tended not to have children, the community was, because it was multi-generational. There are other communities in Europe, for example, where it was mostly military men who again fled, after the war and had to leave their families behind, or their families, were killed or something had happened. So it tended to be adult, more adults in the community than anything else. But the community in San Francisco was very multi-generational. So lucky enough that they came even with grandparents. It was the whole family. Others were not so lucky, came alone. So because it was multi-generational, and you had this sort of wide variety of people who had all kinds of experience, whether it was in teaching or in in art, or they were very concerned about educating their children. So they opened a children's home early on. It was they bought a house on Post Street in 1926, and it became a children's home that lasted well into the post-war era. And the woman who ran it was Dr. Maxima Bakulaev. She was a doctor in Russia, and then she also got her medical degree in the United States, which was very, very difficult to do. There are a lot of doctors that weren't able to practice because they couldn't, with the English, they couldn't pass the American exams, but she did. And she was instrumental, along with several other people, in starting this children's home. And so they that for two reasons. One was to maintain cultural heritage. The other was to assist parents who had to work. And most of the women had to work. They worked outside the home just like the men did, because they all had fairly low paying jobs, and they had to. So that was very helpful to the community. And then, of course, the church, which the Holy Trinity, which is on Van Essen Green, Central. The priest at the time was Zakorovich, who was somebody that was really respected and revered. He was very helpful to the emigres, and they had every community group at one point or another had meetings in the basement of the church because they could do it for free. And they had a library in the church, and they also had a school. So all of these attempts to make sure that children would not forget their heritage, I think was very, very helpful to maintaining that Russian community sort of culture that extended, after World War II and on into the future, because they had this first foundation where they tried to make sure that that the heritage wasn't lost.
Thank you. Yeah, even though Russian community was working together, people in it was working together towards like the common goals, like keeping their heritage, the history. It doesn't mean that never have dramas in it. So I'd like to cover that 1925 parade.
Oh, the parade.
The parade, and generally the differences between the Fillmore and Potrero Hill neighborhood, and that little clash within them.
So yes, so as I mentioned, the spiritual Christians generally settled in Potrero Hill, and the emigres generally settled into Fillmore. I mean, it's not exclusive, but that's kind of how it ended up. And in 1925, it was the 75th anniversary of California becoming a state in the Union. So the state government and San Francisco government planned this huge event that lasted for a week and a half. I think it was called Diamond Jubilee. And the Russians were invited kind of last minute. I mean, the plans for this event had been going on for a long time, but James Phelan, who had he was senator and all kinds of other positions, he knew a Russian guy in LA, and he had him contact the community. LA and San Francisco had kind of a close relationship in terms of, because there was a Russian community in LA too. So people would kind of go back and forth a lot. But so he got, his name was Avenir Liebhardt, and he changed it to Lehart. that's another thing. Almost everybody changed their names. But so he had him arrange to have a Russian contingent, but they only had like 2 or 3 weeks. And it's amazing that some of them in the book, that they, had costumes and they built this huge float and horses and everything. And so Avenir, who apparently didn't understand the problematic relationship between the spiritual Christians and the emigres, invited the spiritual Christians as well. So they, of course, were going to march with the Soviet flag. And
the spiritualist ones,
spiritual Christians, well, the Molokani,
they preferred the Soviet flag.
Well, they had, so like I mentioned, they had been in the United States. They had started coming earlier, and when they left Russia, they didn't really have fond memories of it because they had been persecuted.
Okay.
So to them, the Bolshevik Revolution was a positive thing because they were very much involved in labor movements and rights for the worker. So it doesn't. I couldn't figure out exactly who disinvited them, but they were disinvited. And I think it was James Phelan actually, because he was not interested in having leftist commies, marching in his parade. Oof. He wanted the, exotic, costumes of the Russian imperial period, and he wanted to make a big show. So they were disinvited. And then after the parade, the leaders of the spiritual Christian community began to attack what they called the Green Street Colony, because the Holy Trinity is on Venice and Green, so they called them the Green Street Colony. And there was a sort of war of words that happened in the papers where the spiritual Christians were accusing the Russians the emigres of speaking for the entire Russian community. And I found that interesting that he said that, because even though he was attacking them, this was a specific guy in the spiritual Christian community. His name was Fred Sasoyev, and he was very, avid workers' rights person and everything. But even though he was angry, he still spoke about them in the sense that it's one Russian community, and he was angry that they were speaking for all of them, but he acknowledged that they did have a common past. So that was the issue with the parade. And then in the late 1920s, or actually about that time, several of the Molokan families in San Francisco joined what's called the Commune. There's a California Commune. And they had gotten permission from the Soviet Union to return to Russia and farm in the Dome region. So there are several families from San Francisco. It wasn't just San Francisco, it was Canada and all over California. There was about 5 families that went back to, and they immediately started to have serious problems. They were attacked, and then there was threats against them, and so on. So, and spiritual Christian families are large. They all had 8, 10, 12 children, and they took them with them to Russia. But most of the children had been born in the United States, so they were U.S. citizens. The parents were not U.S. citizens, so that created a huge problem because they couldn't come back. So after lots of negotiations and going back and forth, the families that left managed to come back. And after that, even though it's not stated explicitly anywhere, I got the impression that after experiencing what they had experienced in the Soviet Union, they kind of backed off on the the Soviet Union is a great place for workers, because that was the main thing. They felt that as laborers they would be, they would be respected, and they would have the kind of prestige that they couldn't have in the United States. Because remember, they've been working in the United States for the last 10 or maybe 12 years. They've been working also in difficult jobs, and they, farming also if they were out in the countryside. And they understood that in the United States that labor was always sort of bound to capital, that, there were no unions at the time. there's no OSHA, so people would get injured or crippled, and there was nothing that anyone could do about it. And so they had this idea that in the Soviet Union it would all be different. But after that, I got the impression that this hostility between the two groups kind of decreased a little bit, and there was lots of interactions. There were people like Nikolai Borzov, who was a teacher, and he came with his family and lived in Berkeley, and he had connections to the spiritual Christian community. He helped them start a school. They would have lectures. They had all kind of cultural events. So the hostility that was sort of evident, particularly in the beginning, diminished after a time. I mean, there are still spats, but it wasn't as severe as it had been before. And they cooperated on several events that I talk about later, like the 1937 Yarmarka. They had a fair in celebration of opening the Golden Gate Bridge, and all of the Russian communities participated in that. It wasn't just the emigres. The Molokani were there, the Baptists were there, everybody. So they were able to cooperate for cultural events. They still, were kind of, they had very different customs. If you know anything about the Molokan Church, they don't have priests. They don't have icons or crosses. It's a very different way of worshiping. And they're very endogamous, and a lot of times they only marry each other. I mean, that kind of fails after a while because they run out of people to marry. But they have their own very specific way of living. But they're all Russian, and they were able to find ways to cooperate and not to have this total hostility going on all the time.
Yeah, thank you. Well, maybe we can cover a mental territory called Imagined Russia and how it's different from Russia abroad.
Yes. Okay. So Russia abroad is a concept that Mark Ryev, a scholar, talked about initially, that it was Russia outside of Russia. And in his discussion of it, he felt that it ended when the war started, World War II, for various reasons. And he didn't really acknowledge that there was a Russia abroad in the United States. He was mostly talking about Europe. But when I started doing this research, and particularly in terms of the space of California and Northern California and the history that existed here, in the Russian-American company in the 19th century, the fact that Fort Ross was built and established, all of this sort of had a big impact on the immigrant community when they came, because they didn't necessarily know about this just because we know about it or people in California knew this history. It wasn't something that was necessarily on top of people's minds. None of them ever thought they would be coming to the United States. So when they landed in San Francisco, first of all, what was helpful was the church. I mean, I mentioned that already. And the fact that there was an established congregation, and there were priests who were helping them. But when I talk about Imagined Russia, I sort of look at the physical space that involved not just the city and the urban environment, but the fact that Fort Ross and that whole area of Sonoma County is also kind of this imagined Russia. And that's because when they went to Fort Ross, even though it was actually very, very much in ruins at that time, they felt a connection. There was a chapel there, and that Russians had been living in the space. There was a cemetery where Russians were buried, and so they sort of felt this, like perhaps there was a reason that they had come to this particular place. And they started to do a lot of research about the history of Fort Ross and what it meant, and even creating poetry. There's lots of writings among the Russian immigrant community about life in California and the historical incidents, like, for example, the really famous story of Nikolai Ryazanov and Conchita, which everybody loves. So they write poetry about that. So this became a way for them to deal with the fact, because over time it became clear that they were never going home. And almost no one repatriated. I can probably, there's like, of all the people I looked at, maybe 3 or 4 returned to the Soviet Union, and that was after World War II. So, so with this realization that they were here for good, they had to find a way to live their lives and still maintain some kind of connection to their cultural heritage. And this became the whole space, this sort of mental territory, became important in that sense. And even what before I knew anything about this community, I always assumed that the fact that Russians go to Russian River and have dachas there, that this was something that was a post-World War II thing, but it wasn't. They started doing it almost immediately. When people were able to earn some money, they would area and build, they were very, very plain. In fact, some people didn't even have electricity and running, but it became a place that and it helped them to just sort of come to terms with the fact that this was their new home. So I talk about that in terms of what mental territory means, how people perceive the place where they live. They have a different perception of it than someone else. For example, if they're walking down the street in a strange city and they see a Russian church, it's to them, to a Russian person who's Orthodox and sees an Orthodox church, then it's a sign of home. Whereas someone who is not Orthodox, or who's not Russian and sees a Russian church, it might be interesting, it might be something exotic, it might be pretty, but it doesn't have that meaning for them. And so this was kind of an important way for them to adapt to their new life here. And by building all of the community institutions, they sort of expanded that on their own, with the children's home, all of the organizations, a lot of which, they tended to start clubs and drama groups, and then they would end, and then someone else would start them, or they'd have a fight, and an argument, and somebody would go and start their own drama club. But they were constantly trying to maintain this like cultural life, not only for themselves, but, for the next generation.
Thank you. But does it mean that your life will be there for them for all their lives, or how many people will decide to Americanize versus keep that balance of finding Russianness and being connected by the Pacific Ocean from where it came from, or Fort Ross, or even Orthodox churches? What was the ratio between those people, if any?
I think in general, they built a strong foundation for the next generation. So if they hadn't done that, then we wouldn't see what we see today, right? I mean, we still have the pilgrimages to Fort Ross every year. That has gone on for 100 years without fail. So I'm trying to, it's a complicated question. Some of that has to do with the age of the person when they arrived. For example, there were certainly young people who particularly people who were born like between 1914 and 1917, and who really didn't have memories of Russia of their own. Their memories were their parents' memories. So there was a conversation in about 1939 where one of the people in the community was talking about how they were trying to be more organized about helping the disabled veterans. That was always a constant theme, trying to like send money to the poorer veterans in Europe and so on. And the person who was talking said that I tried to get the young people involved. And when he said young people, he was talking about people who were at that time between 23 or 25 years old. And they're just not interested. They have their own lives. They're, starting families. And I can't get them interested in this topic because to them, this is something that's in the past and they're looking to the future. So there were very different perspectives depending on the generation, but there were always people who were there to continue that, that cultural sort of connection. In other words, some people decided, I'm just going to Americanize totally, and I'm going to go out and build my life and not worry about all this Russian stuff. But there was always a contingent that didn't want to just leave it all behind. So, each person chose for themselves what they wanted to do. And thankfully, there were enough people who were willing, to put out the effort. And most of them, again, they didn't have money. So it had to do with their own work or putting in the time. And they were willing to do that. And I think that foundation was very, very helpful to the second wave that came after World War II, because they already had all of these established institutions. The Russian Center was started in 1939. The churches were there. They had all kinds of artistic and drama clubs that went on into the post-World War II era. So in that sense, they were, they actually helped the next group as well.
Yeah, do you think it was happening also just because they can, meaning their support on behalf of the government? Like, it's extremely hard to obtain citizenship in Europe, while in the States, I think you said in the book, people who moved in 1920 will become citizens by 1930. So it will generally take them a decade to get their citizenship.
It was people who arrived in the early 1920s, in general, were able to become citizens by 1930. And it sort of happened in waves too, depending on when people arrived, because the rules, did change as well in terms of citizenship. But at that time, if you, the main stipulation was that you maintained 5 years uninterrupted residence in the United States. And so people who arrived, say, in 1923, would be able to technically apply for citizenship in 1928. And they did. And that was surprising to me as well, because the general idea about emigres is always that, they would never turn away from Russia, and they would maintain their identity till death. And if they, renounce, their Russian heritage. But it was absolutely untrue. Almost everyone naturalized as soon as possible. And I think that had to do a lot with the nativist environment. There were, just kind of like now, there's kind of an anti-immigrant sort of, there's xenophobia, and you feel very insecure, when you're not a citizen. And particularly in their situation, because most immigrants that arrived at that time, theoretically speaking, if they really didn't like it, they could just go back home. If you were Italian, go back to Italy. But they had nowhere to go. And even so, there was actually a lot of, I forgot to mention this, there's a lot of traffic back and forth between Harbin and San Francisco. People who arrived didn't really like it, went back to Harbin, realized they couldn't live there anymore, would come back again. So it really wasn't people coming and saying, yes, this is great, this is where I want to live. It took a lot to get accustomed to American life. And I mentioned in the book as well that the American society at that time in the 1920s was going through enormous changes. You know, the modernization of society, the industrialization, the role of women was changing. That's when we started the big consumer-oriented, society where people started to buy all kinds of things that they didn't have before. The automobile was something that was new and changed societies significantly. So not only were they new to the United States, but they were dealing with all of the changes that were going on in the United States at the same time. So it was very difficult for people, and a lot of people didn't really like it, but they didn't have any alternative. Some people liked it a lot, So I can't. There's no one impression, because you would read a range of opinions about what life was like in the United States. Some people liked it right away. Other people didn't feel at home. They felt lonely. They felt like they were out of place. They felt hostility, but gaining citizenship was right at the top of the list. I think almost everyone who arrived in that period were citizens, because people continued to arrive. It wasn't just in the 1920s. They arrived in the 1930s and in the late 1930s. But if they could, they all became citizens. And if they didn't, once the war, there was a huge. The United States initiated the alien. Were not a citizen, you had to register, which they had not had to do that before. But once the war started, it became even more imperative to become citizens for security reasons. I think for themselves, for their own internal sense of security and safety.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we can go for forever. There's so many different angles and so many fascinating topics in this book to discuss and just to learn about. But I want to save some time for questions from our audience.
Okay.
And I'll have a couple more questions for Dr. Bogdan. And I mentioned earlier that you worked with the city of San Francisco on this Russian history context document. And I actually attended this meeting at the Internet Archives on behalf of Globus Books, of course. And to me, it's still a mystery what's the purpose of this document and what's the city is working on, like doing it. Because when we asked them what is it for, they said we're just collecting stories. We want to create this collective memory of Russian immigration in San Francisco. And when I asked a question, do you fact check those stories? Said, of course not. So what is your perspective on that? And
as a former FBI
yes, there must be something suspicious about it. Well, I was actually very surprised when they, because of the situation right now with Russia and the war against Ukraine and everything, I was very surprised that they persisted in this. But again, it's not just the Russians. I mean, there's a Chinese, a historic context statement. I think Filipino, and in they're going to have a meeting next Wednesday to whether to adopt the statement. And they mentioned that there are other Slavic groups that they want to cover, which is enormous. It's enormous work. I am under the impression that this has to do with, because it's the city planning department. From what I understand, I don't live in San Francisco anymore. From what I understand, there's all kinds of plans to change the building codes and build tall buildings. So I think in part this is a way to preserve architecture. And a lot of the buildings that are involved in this historic context statement for Russians are historic buildings. So if they become either city or state or federal landmarks, then they can't be touched. But the other side of the coin there is if your building becomes a landmark, then there's all kinds of restrictions about what you can do with it, like nothing, I mean, without permission. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword. But I'm assuming that this is the main reason that they're doing this, because, at least some people have figured out that if you tear everything down that's old, you're kind of destroying the whole neighborhood concept of the city. So I think that's the reason that they're doing it. I don't know. I don't see any other purpose for it.
Yeah, well, thank you for your honesty. And even though their purposes are very pragmatic, I'd like to thank you for this document, because it took you a lot of time to finish it and work on it. And just mentioning small businesses like ours, for example, that I want to believe will go down in some history and this document as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think they will adopt it. I don't see why they wouldn't. What was interesting was that it was very serendipitous, because I had just finished. I was in the process of finishing the book, so I had just done this 6 years of this research, and when they contacted me, I said, "Yeah, sure." But if I hadn't done that research, it would have taken me another 10 years to write that statement, because you've seen it. It's very long. But all of that's in there. I had already done most of the research. So if they hadn't asked me at that particular time, it may not have been done. But because they did, and they hadn't never heard of me. The only reason they contacted me was because of Dr. Cherney. He used to be a professor at San Francisco State, and he knew me. And
In what department?
He was a history professor, but he's like 80. I mean, he's long retired.
Let's see. And the final question: the title of this book is "There is San Francisco's Russian Diaspora from Revolution to Cold War." Are there any plans to write a book on the other waves of immigration? We're ready to talk that they're still happening.
Well, I originally had planned to write this book about both the first and second wave, but it was impossible. Even with this one, when I first went to the publisher, they said, we want 80 to 100,000 words. And I said, that's just not going to happen. There's no way I can get this to 80,000 words. So because of the I kept raising the word count, and they kept agreeing. So, finally we agreed on I think we agreed on 130, and it still ended up being 145,000 words. But I could not fit everything in, because I would have had to shortchange the first wave, which to me was actually way more than the second wave, because I hadn't known anything about it. So I have the research for the second wave, so I could potentially do that book. But I've started looking at a different group of Russians who are Russian brides who married the soldiers who went to Siberia, the American soldiers.
Oh, wow.
During the Civil War, 1918, 1919. And I couldn't figure out who these women were when I was doing the research, because I knew they were Russian, but I couldn't find an entry passenger list for them. And that it ended up because they were all married to Americans, and they were coming in under their husband's name. Once I figured that out, I saw that this was a specific group. And so I think I may be focusing on them, and in the context of more about how Russian women in general sort of built their lives in the United States, because I have a lot of information on it that just didn't fit into this book.
Huh.
So I'm thinking that I'm going to do that, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Well, good luck with that. We cannot wait for the new book.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, Stas, you're the first.
Before my sort of a two-part question, I'd like to throw out a movie title, Jack Восьмеркин and Americans. Anyone who, like me, left after 93 saw that film, and it's about an American who comes to Soviet Union because he heard that they're giving land to everyone there. If you don't know it, it's...
What's the name of the movie?
Jack Восьмеркин, an American. Восьмеркин is his name in the film.
No.
And he has a terrible time there because of that. like just like you said. But my question is really is a two-part. One, the how, if at all, your research touched upon the Russian Catholics, because Our Lady of Fatima Church is in San Francisco, and on the Finns in Berkeley, if at all.
The Finns?
They're split to this day into a red and white.
Oh, yeah.
And they have their own meeting places because of the split that occurred during the Great Depression. If at all there is a footnote in your book, or if it ever came close to looking at that stuff.
Regarding the Finns, I actually have a footnote
Okay,
about
good.
the Finns.
Good.
I don't know if I transferred it from the dissertation to the book or not,
Okay.
but it was about the fact that they had a society which was pro-Soviet,
Mm-hmm.
and the consul at the time, Romanovsky, was reporting to the police department about all of the leftist groups in San Francisco, and they were one of the people on his list. One of the groups on his list.
That's the red hole today. I believe there is still a white hole in Berkeley as well as separate meeting places. That's what I was told by someone in the neighborhood of the Finnish hall I went to.
That's interesting that they still maintain that. Considering
that's what I was told. I don't know. I haven't figured out where the other Finns congregate, the white ones.
And then regarding the Catholics, yeah, I didn't really touch on that at all.
They had an amazing library there until it was given to Hoover.
Yes, and I actually looked at one of their collections, which has a lot of great stuff in it.
Yeah.
But as a group, I didn't really focus on them at all. I do mention that among the Orthodox, there were actually a very diverse. Every single religion: Catholics, there was Lutherans, Russians, Starovere, and I'm talking about like the applications for students that I was looking through, because they would list their religious faith.
Mm-hmm.
Most, of course, were Pravoslavne, but they were, every religion, was represented. Even Muslims, there's a couple of Muslims that came.
Their library was incredible. I went there. I was a Catholic at the time. Complete subscription to Puch.
Oh, really?
From Paris. Every periodical. The old man who was like the spiritual heart. He was a secular guy. I don't know when he died, but he was the heart of it, and they had everything. And by the time I started attending, there were no Russian speakers really anymore. So the books were just sitting there. I tried to catalog them a bit, but it was just too much for one. And then I stopped being Catholic, and eventually something went to some nuns, the convent that was friendly with the Fatima Church, and a big chunk, I guess, to Hoover Institute.
Thank you, Stas. Are there any other questions? Could be comment, could be yes.
I have a question. Hi, thank you for your speech and the book. I'm wondering, could we run into Russians who were like, are there still these Russians, or maybe among us today, who've been here for several generations? Or at this point, the Russians that you were mentioning, 1920s, that first wave who came in, like by now, quite dissolved and hard to find.
Well, I'm sure that some people stayed in the Bay Area. It's an interesting question, because an interesting project would be to find the descendants and interview them and find out at what point they either moved away from being, I think it would be a really great project about that first wave, and why I talk a lot about how their history was kind of erased because the Fillmore was completely torn down, and when you tear down the physical space, it kind of changes the entire history. But as I was tracing a lot of these people for this database I'm creating, they went everywhere in the United States. Their descendants are in Idaho and Utah and Arizona and the East Coast. So I think there are a lot of people. A lot of my research was on Ancestry.com, and I found a lot of people who were who were trying to find out their family histories who were descendants of that first wave. So they're out there all over. And I think there are a lot of people who may not even know that they may have Russian roots because of, people intermarried with other groups and stuff. So yes, I think they've populated the United States, and I think there are actually people who may not know that they have Russian roots. So hopefully, maybe when they read the book, they'll be more interested.
Okay, please.
So you mentioned that like some Russians liked it in the US, others didn't like, but were there any kind of like perceptions of the American culture or American life at that time that were common across community? Either positive or negative? What kind of stood out to them as like very different?
Well, there were, I think there was a general sort of idea about the very materialistic nature of American society. People would mention that. I have in the book, I talk about how one of the emigres was wrote for the newspaper that American culture, though it has its interesting points, can be quite insipid. I mean, he wrote it in Russian, obviously. So this was at a time that they were trying to have rapprochement with the American community, particularly with wealthy Americans, because many of the people who came prior to 1917 who had established themselves in the community were encouraging them to associate with jobs or make contacts. And most of those, for various reasons, it was just cultural clashes. So they were cognizant of the fact that American culture was, could be very difficult for people who are not so materialistically motivated, and they would comment on that. So yeah.
Yeah, something like they can suck your soul out of you or something. Like,
Yes, yeah. He said, one other person he said.
Yeah.
Атлеты, постоянно жующие жвачку. That was a summation that someone had that typifies
Oh, really?
athletes gum chewing athletes. All Americans are gum chewing athletes.
Yes, and there was a conversation where they said as well that the difficulty of communicating is that Americans just want to talk about money and sports, and the Russians want to talk about things that are completely obscure to Americans, so they could never find a common ground. So
What
they were
can
aware of that.
Dostoevsky bring us closer to each other?
We have a question, please.
Yes. Could you please remind me the historical period of your book? What the time frame you cover?
The main time frame is from 1917, and that's because when the revolution happened, to about the early 1960s.
Early 1960?
Yes. The last chapter is about the post-World War II wave.
Okay.
So that's the rest of it is about the interwar period. So the last chapter covers about 1946 or so to the early 1960s, but it's very limited.
Gosh darn it, it needs a sequel.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
so it means 96. So after 1960, our community in San Francisco disappeared into oblivion.
There is no document about
It hasn't
us.
yet. As long as the book is here, we're
I'm
fine.
sorry, guys. I'm asking.
The title is Before We Disappeared to Oblivion. So it's up in the air as to whether they did. But I do make the case that the interwar community did disappear. And because it disappeared, actually, physically, the space completely changed. You can't find all the places that I talk about in the book because the city rebuilt them all, which is an interesting point that we're talking about, the historical context statement. So in that sense, that community did disappear. But the post-World War II community, I think
Andy, please, you are next.
Like, since you said there are multiple waves of immigrations, like, do they kind of stuck in era, like after the immigrant here? Like, do they like kind of stuck in their own like habits and tradition from like different time period? Like I went to the Russian center before, and then they still have the coat of arms of the Russian Empire and all that.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a very interesting question. And so what I did was the post World War II wave really brought up or kind of focused on the fact of the death of the Tsar and his family, and putting up portraits of Nicholas and the coats of arms and everything like that. The first wave was really not into that very much. And that surprised me too, because that's what I thought I would find when I started doing the research, that they were constantly possibly talking about the Lost Empire and everything, but that wasn't it. I found that they were very interested in the democratic process. As I mentioned in the book, most people registered as Democrats, not Republicans, which is completely opposite to what had happened after World War II. But the post-World War II group became very much more entrenched in that, our country was stolen from us, and we have to, remember the monarch. There are people who are actually still monarchists after all this time, and you didn't really find that in that first wave. That they didn't have that kind of nostalgia for autocracy. They liked the idea, despite the fact that they had all these problems with cultural misunderstandings with Americans. They liked the idea of living in a democratic country, and they understood the importance of it. Whereas with, and I'm sure the second wave did too, but they just tended to really revert to this sort of, as I mentioned in the book, that they started all these organizations that had to do with the monarchists and making sure that everybody remembered that this was the beginning of the Exodus because of the death of the Tsar, and that was not really prevalent in the first wave. So it's kind of an interesting, phenomenon that I would explore if I wrote another book.
Anya, please, you had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for the book, for the research, and for today's conversation. I was on the cemetery in Colma, and I saw many people who were born in Harbin. And you mentioned today that they arrived from Harbin, here, San Francisco. I wonder how many years they spent in Harbin. What happened there?
Well, that's that depended on whether they immigrated to Harbin just after the city was built. It was 1898, I think, that it was completed, or if the people that I'm talking about in general terms, like when I was talking about the soldiers who crossed the border and had to go to Harbin and then came to the United States, then they were in Harbin for a very temporary period. They were just passing through. But Harbin had a very large Russian community, and actually it was very multi-ethnic. They had all kinds of communities in Harbin at that time. Obviously, the Russians were probably the largest. But like, for example, with my own family, my mother was born there. And not only was she born there, but her mother was born there. Because her father, her father, which would be my great-grandfather, worked for the Chinese Eastern Railroad. So they came prior to the revolution because there was economic opportunity in Harbin, and they had a very large Russian community. But there were also the group that just, when the revolution happened and the Civil War, you had tens of thousands of people coming to Harbin, and there was just no way that they could. There's no support structure for them. There's no jobs. There's nothing. So they had to find a way to get out, and that's why they tried to come to the United States or other countries if they could possibly do it. But yeah, it's a very long and complicated history. There's a lot of books about Harbin if you're interested that talk about that whole process of building the city and the Russian community and so on.
Okay, well, we have time for one more question, and then we're going to move to informal part of the evening. And do you have another one?
Yeah, I found it interesting. Like in Harbin now, you can still find many like Russian things, also like food. Like there are the Chinese version of the kvass, and there are multiple kind of the Eastern European sausages. That's like in Harbin, and they're sold as like the famous things and all that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
When I was there, I went to the store and bought the Russian bread that they still make it. It's really good. I got a
They're
whole
so
load.
different from the actual Russian one. I think they have like jams and like fruits in there.
Okay, thank you, Andy. You made me hungry. Well, thank you, Dr. Bogdan.
Thank you.
Yes, I would kindly ask to fold the chair so we can make more room, and please feel free to go and ask another question.
То есть иди до вас,
I just felt John like barging in. Everyone else is
we just had this thought where I work with
Everybody down question.
Sorry. You know there is is this a heritage press? Yeah, which one? Others and children. Does the legislation use the word children? That's the newest one. Maybe not. Stas.
You were in the back all this time. You were in the back all this time.
We only carry
We were talking about
I was wondering, you said that, that's why I couldn't remind you of the question. You said it's all
No.
you said it's all Russians that you made from different times and stuff in different periods.
Really? I mean, if you buy one more.
I got all this
Yeah, I mean,
And you were actually
I've been working a little bit. I got the Come there up. I'm at the buying counter. You really stuff those good. Where'd you go? Oh. Okay. Oh, okay. So we're going for like
Are you going to buy the book?
no, we have it. Why would I do that? Can we order it throwing them at I mean, I would not.
I am buying this. Okay. So, nice.
Нет, это ты повезешь ее домой.
Ты повезешь ее домой.
Мам, это Таня. Таня.
Я восприняла за Веронику, потому что у меня все молодые. Константин сказал, Таня на несколько поколений моложе Вероники, для меня все молодые.
Да.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm paying. Or you going there?
She wants to use the bathroom. Go straight.
Sorry, I'm behind you. Yeah. Okay.
That's why she's always asking me about Romania.
Mainly I've been
You watch Soviet songs? Somebody brings dressed up as
It's a bit of a.
he gives the gift to somebody. 25 volumes of film checking. Yeah, it's a musical. It's only remotely connected to the book. You know, Alexander. He gets lost and then sees you he's shouting,
like your seat and you need to see the bed.
oh, I forgot.
It's fine. I asked the wrong person. It's alright. Yeah. Yeah, I need to. I got like just a small space. Browsing what she was talking about. But yeah, it's been a while. Oh, I came from. Well, I was at the doctor before that. Me too. I was about to go to Central, but I was like, I have to go. I was just looking for Rasmus last week.
And I saw you were making like some notes.
Oh yeah. I wish I had my notebook because they gave a beautiful little pilgrimage notebook to all the people who came to the conference on Friday. So, it would be nice to have those in there, but at least I had something. Yeah, interesting. I don't know, I missed a little bit. Did she talk about people? I mean, she did say some people wanted to assimilate, some people wanted to disappear. I was wondering if she talked about why she wanted to disappear. Because I had a family like I had to dream something. Ask my grandma. And then she would tell me about
Yeah, she did talk about that. I think in the beginning she was mostly talking about like why she decided to write this movie. So, yeah, but it's really interesting.
I didn't want to.
And one more question that we Russians came white people. And we didn't think they like somehow.
Она ему начала плести, что я вообще
Before we disappeared, that
самая высокомерная.
when they arrived,
Поэтому
again being white,
что-то после одного вопроса не поступило. А после одного вопроса не поступило. Какой 38.02 с налогом? Так, я кредитку?
Да.
think the American way. I talked about the racial hierarchy that exists in the United States. So, yeah, I mean, that was just because it came up.
Дебет как нет.
It's mentioned, and I was going to talk to you.
Что
Wanted us to sell this idea of
Вы хотите бумажный пакет?
different people, different ways, how black people manage to get jobs in certain places. Russians come out like, no, they think of themselves really as white. I think that happened
So it will be 76.99 for the tax?
and whiteness became more important. In the interwar period, they just seemed to recognize there was a racial hierarchy, and for them it was strange because they were, in Russian culture, at least in Imperial Russia, race was separated people and more class. So for them, it was something different, but they recognized right away that being white was very important. And I do mention instances of Russians or people who came from Russia who were not necessarily white. I mean, who were Mongolian. After the war, there was a group of orphans who were Chinese and that they experienced discrimination. So this was something new. It's not something that anybody really talks about now. So anyway, I talked about that a lot in my book, so it's interesting.
Well, I wanted to brought it up, but I didn't know how to ask it. And you brought the word. It's like, it's great for me. Yeah, because my Mexican friend that Anna, Russians look like Americans.
Yeah. When you say American, they use yeah, so but that's the thing. With Russian, there was a lot of different sort of in terms of Siberia, people who were immigrating, sometimes you could tell they had some indigenous background. But for them, that was relevant. It's like here, if you're going to pick factors, how you look. And I tell the story of one guy who came in the 1930s who was part Chinese. He had so
It's good to know that I can look at the
people came.
That's really nice.
So
For those of us who
so
don't
it's
make
just
it,
an
but want to.
example.
Yeah.
Your physical appearance was monitored when you entered the country. And, if you're blonde and wise, that's fine. They're still Russian. So I try to explore that. How they Americanized, or not.
Thanks for answering that.
Yes,
It's such an interesting conversation.
Yes, I think thank you so much. It's very interesting conversation.
Belarusian.
Oh, thank you. Do you spell it G-I-G-I-A?
Их захват, вот именно они, вот такие, они у всех есть, у всех вызывают очень приятное воспоминание.
Yeah. I want to do that.
I guess. I have a lot of friends in Russia who are looking for relatives to come here.
Uh-huh. Well, the bigger Cossack group came after. There was a small Cossack group.
O,
that
ja
was
nie jedną
Cossack.
Ktoś
I don't even really talk about them because they were very small. After the war,
Вам нужен пакет?
there were
Нет,
several thousand.
я тогда
In fact, yes, after Second World War. In fact, they're having a big party on October 17th, celebrating. So yes, there were quite a big community of Cossacks.
And they're still here?
Oh yeah.
Because I was looking for some particular person, and I found that they have some house. I mean,
Yeah.
some
They had,
building or
well, I think the one they use now is across the street from Sabor, Fury Street. There's a scout's house, which they also use as a
но
Cossack
кредитную
house.
карту будет небольшой счет.
Yeah, it's across the
Если у
street.
вас
You can
есть
see it's got
дебет-карту, мы
glass,
можем сделать
glass facade. They used to have their own house, but they, I think they had to sell it or something like that. But there was a lot. There were a lot out there, and they were kind of dominating the Russian community pretty much because they were.
Пакет нет, спасибо.
We went from Shanghai to Tuvalu. Yeah. I don't write about that too much. It's a little bit.
I think there's a line though that I were you waiting yet to buy? I can bring you up at a different terminal, I guess. Yeah, I would have to write it down and I will be right back with it. That sounds good.
потому что здесь сейчас современные дети, которые здесь рождаются, у меня есть племянник, который говорит с очень сильным акцентом, а племянница, которая мама русская, папа американец, она очень говорит по-русски. So I admire people who moved there, who wasn't born there.
I read a lot in Russian because it helps me to not forget. And I like to read, so at least I have that, but I don't have anyone to talk
It's even
to.
harder to read in Russian. Thanks because it's easier to read it harder, slower.
I can read and write, but that's because I went to Moscow school.
Wow.
I hated it, but I think that's what kept it, you know.
Here in San Francisco?
Yeah, I grew up there. I only left about 12 years ago.
So have you ever been in Russia?
Yes, several times.
Before?
Yeah. Yeah. The last time I was 2010. 2010. Yeah. And I really enjoyed it. It's so different. I mean, I was there in 2002 and then 2010, and I thought, oh, things
You
are
could
really
taxable
getting better.
B152.
Yeah, 4 years later.
One was 21. I guess there was one. It's okay, it's fine. That's what I was expecting.
I was researching my
Oh,
family.
that's right.
But
You know what? I want to support you guys, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think if you don't mind, that would be helpful.
So I stayed with them, and then I went to Petersburg. Then I did like a boat tour to Ladoga and the Kijy, and then I took the train, and then I went down to Sibirsk, Ulyanovsk, which is where my family's from, and then I went all the way across Siberia to China. Yeah, so yeah, I wish I could. I mean, I would do it again, but I don't think I'll ever go back to it. No. Not now. I can't imagine coming back. But yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Я пришла в информацию, да, остается на связи. На связи.
Oh, I knew you looked familiar. Did we ever meet?
We did. NCT.
Yeah. Oh, God, so nice to see you. Hey, I didn't think you knew that you lived in San Francisco.
Well, I don't. I live in the far east of the Bay Area.
Oh, okay.
That's too far.
All right, do you want me to say it?
Actually, I talked to Ben and she said it was okay to give you a discount. So
And I can,
that's very nice. I can really small surcharge and credit.
so I can tell Professor